The year was 1942, and the North African desert stretched endlessly beneath a merciless sun. Sand particles hung suspended in the scorching air, creating a haze that blurred the horizon where Earth met sky. In this hostile landscape, where temperatures soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, men fought not just against enemy forces, but against the very environment itself. Among the British 8th Army troops stationed near El Alamein, there existed a hierarchy that every soldier understood instinctively. Officers commanded from their positions, sergeants maintained discipline, and innovators, those rare individuals who saw problems others accepted as inevitable. They occupied a special place in the minds of their fellow soldiers. Some revered them, others mocked them. Most did both, depending on whether the innovation succeeded or failed spectacularly. Private Thomas Reginald Hawthorne belonged to this latter category. The 24-year-old gunner from Manchester had joined the war effort with enthusiasm, like so many young men of his generation, believing that his engineering background from working in his father's textile mill would serve him well. What he hadn't anticipated was how much of warfare involved not grand strategy or heroic charges, but the brutal mathematics of survival measured in seconds. Hawthorne served as part of a machine gun crew, operating the venerable Vickers machine gun, a weapon that had served the British Army since the First World War. The Vickers was reliable, accurate, and when properly maintained, could fire continuously for extended periods. But there was a problem that every gunner knew intimately, a problem that killed men with frustrating regularity: the ammunition. The Vickers fired from fabric belts containing 250 rounds. When a belt ran dry during combat, the crew had to reload, and that process, as it stood in 1942, took anywhere from 30 to 45 seconds under optimal conditions. In combat, with hands shaking from adrenaline, sand gritting between fingers, and incoming fire making every movement desperate and clumsy, reload times could stretch beyond a full minute. 60 seconds. In the fluid chaos of desert warfare, 60 seconds was an eternity. 60 seconds was long enough for an enemy squad to advance 50 yards. 60 seconds was long enough for a German MG-42 to fire 1,200 rounds in your direction. 60 seconds was long enough to lose your position, your crew, your life. The standard system for carrying ammunition belts was simple but flawed. The belts came in metal tins, cylindrical containers that protected the ammunition from sand and moisture. When a reload was necessary, the gunner or loader had to unlatch the tin, remove the belt, ensure no sand contaminated the ammunition, feed it into the weapon, and secure the tin again for the empty belt. Every step consumed precious seconds. Hawthorne had watched men perish during these intervals. He'd seen the panic in a loader's eyes as his fingers fumbled with a latch while tracer rounds drew bright lines through the air above their position. He'd heard the frustrated curses of gunners who knew that in the time it took to reload, the tactical situation could shift from defensible to catastrophic. One evening, as the sun descended toward the western horizon and painted the sand in shades of copper and gold, Hawthorne sat outside his dugout, examining a metal ammunition tin with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts. His crewmates, Corporal Davies and Private Wilson, watched him with the mixture of amusement and concern that had become their default expression when Hawthorne entered what they called his thinking state. Davies, a stocky man from Wales with forearms like steel cables, spoke first. "Tom's having another one of his episodes." Wilson, younger and leaner, grinned. "What's the problem this time, Tommy? The sand too sandy? The sun too sunny?" Hawthorne didn't respond immediately. His fingers traced the rim of the metal tin, feeling the weight, calculating the time required for each movement in the reload sequence. Finally, he spoke, his Manchester accent softened by concentration. "It's not the ammunition that's the problem. It's how we carry it." Davies stretched, joints popping. "We carry it the way the Army tells us to carry it. Same way it's been done since before either of us was born." "That's exactly the problem," Hawthorne replied. "Nobody's questioned whether there's a better way." Wilson laughed not unkindly. "And you're going to revolutionize British military doctrine from a hole in the Egyptian desert?" "Maybe." The simplicity of the response made both men pause. Hawthorne wasn't prone to grandiose claims or wild exaggerations. When he said maybe, he meant he'd already begun working through the problem in his mind, applying the same mechanical thinking he'd used when troubleshooting looms in Manchester. Over the following days, Hawthorne became increasingly withdrawn, spending every spare moment sketching designs in a notebook he'd acquired from a supply sergeant. His crewmates noticed he'd stopped joining them for card games in the evening. Instead, he'd sit apart, sometimes for hours, drawing and redrawing diagrams by lamplight. The desert nights were surprisingly cold, a stark contrast to the blazing days. As temperatures dropped, Hawthorne worked, his breath visible in small clouds as he calculated measurements, angles, and access points. What he was designing seemed absurdly simple on paper, which made him question whether he was missing something obvious. Surely, if the solution was this straightforward, someone would have thought of it before. But sometimes the most effective innovations were the simplest ones. Sometimes the obvious solution remained undiscovered simply because everyone was too busy following established procedures to question them. What Hawthorne envisioned was this: a bag constructed from heavy canvas that could hold multiple ammunition belts in a way that allowed instant access, not a tin that required unlatching and careful handling, not a box that needed opening. A bag with the ammunition belts positioned so that a loader could simply reach in and pull out a ready-to-feed belt in a single fluid motion. The design incorporated several key features. First, the bag would hang from the gunner's position within arm's reach, but positioned so it wouldn't interfere with weapon operation. Second, the belts would be stacked vertically rather than horizontally, with the feed end of each belt oriented upward for immediate access. Third, and most crucially, the top of the bag would remain open, protected only by a loose flap that could be pushed aside with one hand. It was elegant in its simplicity. It was also completely against regulations. When Hawthorne finally showed his designs to Davies and Wilson, their reactions differed sharply. Wilson, ever the optimist, immediately saw the potential. That could work, Tom. That could actually work. Davies, more pragmatic and aware of military hierarchy, shook his head slowly. The sergeant major will have your hide if you show up with some homemade contraption. You know how he feels about non-regulation equipment. Then I won't show up with it, Hawthorne replied. I'll build it, test it, and only present it if it works. And how exactly are you going to build it? Wilson asked. We're in the middle of the desert, not a textile factory. Hawthorne smiled, the first genuine smile his crewmates had seen in days. I worked in a textile mill, remember? I know canvas, I know stitching, and I know a quartermaster who owes me a favor. The quartermaster in question was Sergeant Pettigrew, a man whose position gave him access to a bewildering array of supplies and materials. More importantly, Pettigrew appreciated ingenuity and had little patience for unnecessary regulations. When Hawthorne approached him with a request for heavy canvas, strong thread, and access to a sewing kit, Pettigrew raised a single eyebrow. Building yourself a pillow, are we? Something that might keep men alive, Hawthorne replied honestly. Pettigrew studied the younger man for a long moment, then nodded. You've got 48 hours. After that, I need my sewing kit back, and I never saw you. Hawthorne worked through the night, his fingers moving with the practiced precision of someone who'd spent years working with fabric. The desert night surrounded him, vast and filled with distant sounds, the murmur of conversation from other dugouts, the occasional rumble of vehicles, the bark of a sergeant somewhere in the darkness. The construction process was methodical. He cut the canvas to precise measurements, allowing for seams and stress points. The bag needed to be large enough to hold 6 ammunition belts, the typical loadout for a sustained engagement, but not so large that it became unwieldy. The dimensions were critical: too wide, and it would catch on equipment; too narrow, and the belts might tangle. He reinforced the stress points where the bag would hang from its mounting, using triple stitching and folded canvas for additional strength. The hanging mechanism itself took considerable thought. It needed to support significant weight. The 6 belts would total nearly 40 pounds, while allowing the bag to be quickly detached if necessary. The opening at the top was perhaps the most crucial element. Hawthorne designed it with a loose flap that could be pushed aside with minimal effort, but would fall back into place to provide some protection from sand and debris. The flap wasn't sealed or secured. It didn't need to be. The goal was speed, not perfect protection. By the time the sun rose, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange, Hawthorne had completed his first prototype. He held it up, examining the stitching in the growing light, testing the seams with strong pulls. The construction was solid. The design was sound. Now came the real test. Davies and Wilson found him later that morning, holding the canvas bag with an expression that mixed pride and uncertainty. Davies took one look at the creation and burst out laughing. "You've got to be joking. You want to carry ammunition in a canvas sack? It looks like something you'd use to collect laundry." Even Wilson, who'd been supportive of the concept, seemed dubious when confronted with the actual physical object. "Tom, mate, I know you put work into this, but the sergeant major is going to lose his mind if he sees that thing anywhere near regulation equipment." "Let me demonstrate," Hawthorne said calmly. "Time me." He'd already loaded 6 belts into the bag, carefully positioned with the feed ends upward. Davies, still grinning at what he considered a spectacular example of wasted effort, pulled out his pocket watch. "Ready when you are, inventor." Hawthorne's hand moved in a single fluid motion into the bag, fingers closing around the first belt, pulling it free, the entire movement taking less than 2 seconds. He held up the ammunition belt, ready to feed into a weapon. "Again," Davies said, his grin fading. Another motion, another belt, same speed. The third retrieval took even less time as Hawthorne refined his technique. Wilson grabbed the watch from Davies. "Let me time the next one properly." The fourth belt came out in 1.8 seconds, the fifth in 1.6 seconds. The sixth, which Hawthorne pulled with casual confidence, took exactly 1.5 seconds. Davies stood silent, the watch still in his hand. Wilson let out a low whistle. Neither man was laughing now. "With the standard 10, Hawthorne said quietly, "we're looking at 30 to 45 seconds per reload minimum. With this, from empty weapon to fresh belt loaded and ready to fire, we could be looking at under 10 seconds, maybe less with practice." "That's impossible," Davies whispered, but his tone lacked conviction. He'd just watched it happen. "It's not impossible. It's just different from what we're used to." Wilson picked up the canvas bag, examining it with new respect. "The sergeant major is still going to hate this?" "Probably," Hawthorne admitted. "But I'm not asking the sergeant major. I'm asking you two. Would you rather trust regulation tins that take 45 seconds, or this canvas sack that takes 10? The question didn't require an answer. Both men knew the mathematics of survival. 35 seconds shaved off a reload time wasn't just efficiency. It was the difference between suppressing an enemy advance and being overrun. It was the difference between providing cover for retreating infantry and watching them get cut down in the open. It was the difference between life and an early grave in the North African sand. Davies made his decision with characteristic directness. "We test it properly. Full drill. If it works under realistic conditions, we take it to the lieutenant before the sergeant major can object." Over the next 3 days, Hawthorne's crew conducted unauthorized testing whenever they could steal a few minutes away from regular duties. They practiced reloading drills until their movements became instinctive. They tested the bag under various conditions, after running, to simulate the elevated heart rate of combat, with deliberately sand-covered hands while lying prone, while crouched in a fighting position. The results were consistent. Even under the worst conditions, with trembling hands and simulated stress, reload times never exceeded 15 seconds. Under optimal conditions, they achieved reloads in as little as 8 seconds. Word began to spread through the unit, transmitted through that mysterious communication network that exists in all military organizations, the informal chain of gossip and rumor that flows faster than official channels. Other crews began to hear about Hawthorne's canvas ammunition bag. Some were skeptical. Many were openly dismissive. "Heard about your laundry sack, Hawthorne?" called out Private Anderson from B Company during a water distribution one afternoon. "Planning to wash Jerry's underwear for him after the next engagement?" The laughter that followed was good-natured but pointed. In the rigid structure of military life, deviation from standard procedure invited mockery, even when the deviation might prove beneficial. Hawthorne endured the teasing without response, which only seemed to encourage more of it. The canvas bag became known throughout the battalion, discussed with the kind of amused condescension typically reserved for obviously flawed ideas. Men who'd never seen the bag in action nonetheless felt qualified to dismiss it. "Regulations exist for a reason," Sergeant Major Bradford declared loudly within Hawthorne's hearing, though not directly to him. "Start letting every private design his own equipment and you'll have chaos. Mark my word." But not everyone was dismissive. Lieutenant Morrison, a young officer who distinguished himself during the earlier fighting at Gazala, made a point of observing one of Hawthorne's practice sessions. He stood silently, timing the reloads with his own watch, saying nothing but missing nothing. After the 6th consecutive reload, all completed in under 12 seconds, Morrison spoke for the first time. "Private Hawthorne, you're out of uniform." Hawthorne's heart sank. He'd been so focused on proving the concept that he hadn't considered he might face disciplinary action for using non-regulation equipment, even in training. "Sir, I can explain." Morrison held up a hand. "You're out of uniform because regulation equipment would have you wearing an ammunition vest with metal tins. What you've created isn't in the manual, which presents an interesting problem." "Sir, the interesting problem," Morrison continued, his expression unreadable, "is that your non-regulation equipment performs significantly better than regulation equipment. This puts me in a difficult position." Hawthorne waited, knowing better than to speak. Morrison's expression finally cracked into a slight smile. "The difficult position being that I now have to decide whether to reprimand you for breaking regulations or recommend you for commendation for improving combat effectiveness. I'm leaning toward the latter, but I need to see this work under actual combat conditions." "Combat conditions, sir?" "An engagement is expected within the week, possibly sooner. German forces are probing our positions. When the shooting starts, I want your crew using this canvas bag of yours. If it performs as advertised, I'll take it up the chain of command. If it fails and gets men hurt, you'll face disciplinary action. Clear?" "Clear, sir." Morrison turned to leave, then paused. "Hawthorne, one more thing. If this works, you'll have saved lives. If it doesn't, you'll have proven that sometimes the old ways are old for good reasons. Either outcome is valuable. Carry on." The expected engagement came 4 days later, announced not by orders or trumpets, but by the sudden whistle of incoming artillery fire. The German probe began at dawn, when the desert was still cool and visibility was limited by morning haze. Hawthorne's position was on the northern edge of the defensive line, overlooking a wadi that provided the most likely avenue of approach for enemy forces. As the artillery barrage lifted, replaced by an ominous silence, every man in the position knew what was coming next. "Contact front!" The call came from a forward observation post. Infantry, approximately platoon strength, advancing through the wadi. Davies, positioned behind the Vickers gun, made final adjustments to the weapon's elevation. Wilson crouched beside him, ready to assist with ammunition. Hawthorne positioned himself at the gunner's left shoulder, the canvas bag hanging within easy reach, loaded with 6 fresh belts. His hands weren't steady. That was the first thing he noticed. All the practice sessions, all the confident demonstrations, they hadn't prepared him for the reality of knowing that enemy soldiers were advancing with the intention of taking his position and ending his life. "Steady, lads," Davies murmured, his eye pressed to the gun's sight. "Let them get close. Make every round count." Through the morning haze, shapes began to materialize. German infantry, moving with practiced skill, using the terrain for cover, advancing inbound. Professional soldiers, experienced and dangerous. 600 yards, Wilson called out, his voice tight. 500. 400. Davies' finger tensed on the trigger. Hawthorne could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the canvas bag against his leg, could taste copper in his mouth. 300 yards. Engaging! The Vickers opened up with its distinctive sound, not the rapid chatter of lighter machine guns, but a steadier, heavier rhythm. Tracer rounds arced across the wadi, finding their targets. The advancing German infantry went to ground, seeking cover, returning fire. The battle had begun. For the first minute, the belt fed smoothly, 250 rounds spitting out in controlled bursts. Then came the moment Hawthorne had been simultaneously anticipating and dreading. The belt ran dry, the last round firing with a finality that seemed louder than all the preceding shot. "Reloading!" Davies shouted. Hawthorne's hand moved before conscious thought could interfere. Into the canvas bag, fingers closing around the next belt, pulling it free in one smooth motion. His other hand was already clearing the old belt from the weapon. New belt positioned. Feed system checked. Weapon ready. "Loaded!" Hawthorne called out. Davies resumed firing immediately. The entire reload sequence had taken 9 seconds. Wilson, who'd been watching for enemy movement, glanced back with wide eyes. "Bloody hell, that was fast," but there was no time for celebration or analysis. The engagement continued, German forces attempting to advance, while British defensive fire forced them back. The battle settled into a deadly rhythm. Advance, fire, retreat, regroup, advance again. Hawthorne's crew went through 4 belts in the first 15 minutes of fighting. Each reload flowed smoothly, muscle memory and adrenaline combining, to execute the movements with mechanical precision. The canvas bag performed flawlessly, the ammunition feeding cleanly, despite the sand and dust kicked up by the battle. In the adjacent position, another machine gun crew struggled with their metal tins. Hawthorne could hear their frustrated shouts as a latch stuck, jammed with sand. Their weapon fell silent for nearly a minute while they wrestled with the problem, a minute during which enemy forces advanced another 30 yards. By the time the German probe withdrew, falling back under the weight of concentrated defensive fire, Hawthorne's crew had fired more than 1,500 rounds and executed 6 combat reloads. Average reload time, later calculated by Lieutenant Morrison, who had been timing from his command position, was 10.2 seconds. The crew using metal tins in the adjacent position had averaged 41 seconds per reload and had experienced one complete jam that took nearly 3 minutes to clear. As the morning wore on and the battlefield fell quiet except for the occasional crack of a sniper rifle, Morrison approached Hawthorne's position. The lieutenant's uniform was dusty, his face streaked with sweat and sand, but his expression was unmistakable satisfaction. "Private Hawthorne, your canvas bag just passed its field test. I'll be submitting a report to battalion headquarters this afternoon. Expect questions from people considerably higher ranking than me." News of the engagement spread through the battalion faster than any official report could travel. Within hours, Hawthorne found himself surrounded by gunners from other crews, all demanding to know about the canvas bag that had performed so impressively under fire. The mockery had vanished, replaced by intense interest and professional curiosity. These were men whose lives depended on their weapons functioning flawlessly, men who understood that seconds saved during a reload could mean the difference between survival and disaster. "How much canvas do you need?" asked Corporal Jenkins, a veteran gunner with 3 years of desert fighting experience. "Can it work with the Bren?" Private Matthews wanted to know, referring to the lighter machine gun used by British infantry. "Could you make one for my crew by tomorrow?" That question came from at least a dozen different soldiers. Hawthorne found himself in an unexpected position. In the space of a single morning's combat, he'd gone from being mocked to being sought after. But the attention also brought a practical problem. He'd made one bag. He couldn't possibly produce enough to supply every crew that wanted one. The solution came from an unexpected source. Sergeant Pettigrew, the quartermaster who'd supplied the original canvas, appeared at Hawthorne's position that evening. "Heard you made quite an impression this morning, lad. The bag worked, Sergeant, better than I'd hoped." Pettigrew nodded slowly. "I've got access to canvas. I've got access to sewing equipment. What I don't have is the knowledge of exactly how to construct these bags of yours, but I'm thinking we could solve that problem. Sergeant, you teach me how to make them properly, I'll organize a production line. We'll get every machine gun crew in the battalion equipped." "Interested." Hawthorne's response was immediate. "When do we start?" "Over the next week, while the battalion prepared for the major offensive that intelligence suggested was imminent, a small revolution in equipment occurred. Pettigrew commandeered a supply tent and transformed it into a makeshift factory. Hawthorne spent every spare moment teaching other soldiers the specific techniques required to construct the bags to proper specification. The work was meticulous. Each bag required precise measurements, careful stitching, and proper reinforcement of stress point. Shortcuts resulted in bags that failed under combat conditions, so quality control became paramount. What emerged was an informal production line that would have made Hawthorne's factory owner father proud. Soldiers with sewing experience, and there were more than expected, handled the detailed stitching work. Those with less skill but strong hands managed the cutting and preparation of materials. Hawthorne himself inspected each completed bag, testing the seams, and ensuring the dimensions were correct. Within 10 days, they'd produced enough bags to supply every Vickers crew in the battalion. The bags began appearing on gun positions throughout the defensive line, hanging beside weapons like canvas sentinels. Sergeant Major Bradford, the same man who'd earlier dismissed the concept as chaos-inducing innovation, conducted an inspection of gun positions on the 12th day of production. When he reached Hawthorne's position and saw the canvas bag hanging beside the Vickers, his expression suggested he'd bitten into something sour. "Private Hawthorne, this non-regulation equipment has been approved by Lieutenant Morrison, endorsed by Captain Williams, and recommended for battalion-wide adoption by Major Harrison, Sergeant Major," Hawthorne replied. his tone carefully neutral. Bradford's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then, surprisingly, he nodded curtly. "Carry on, Private. Just make sure it's maintained properly." It was as close to an admission of being wrong as men like Bradford ever came. The true test of the canvas bags came during the Second Battle of El Alamein, when General Montgomery launched the offensive that would break German power in North Africa. The battle began on the 23rd of October 1942 with a massive artillery barrage that turned night into day. Hawthorne's battalion was positioned in the northern sector, assigned to suppress German defensive positions while infantry advanced through the minefields. The role of the Vickers crews was crucial: maintain continuous suppressive fire to keep German soldiers from effectively engaging the advancing British troops. The battle was unlike anything Hawthorne had experienced. The scale was enormous, the noise was overwhelming, and the demands on the machine gun crews were relentless. They fired belt after belt, the barrels of their weapons glowing red in the darkness, cooling systems working at maximum capacity. And through it all, the canvas bags performed flawlessly. Reload after reload, Hawthorne pulled fresh belts from the bag with mechanical precision. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, even as artillery rounds impacted nearby, even as sand and debris rained down on his position, even as exhaustion made every movement feel like it required double the normal effort. 10 seconds. That was the rhythm. Fire until the belt ran dry, reload in 10 seconds, resume firing. The consistency was hypnotic, allowing Davies to maintain almost continuous suppressive fire on the German positions. In the adjacent position, where the crew had stubbornly refused to adopt the canvas bag, preferring to trust in regulation equipment, the situation was markedly different. Hawthorne could hear their frustrated shouts as they struggled with metal tins, could see the gaps in their fire as reloads took 3 and 4 times as long. By dawn of the second day, that crew had been relieved. The gunner, suffering from severe burns after his overheated weapon, starved of continuous fire, had cooked off a round while he was attempting to reload. The crew using canvas bags, including Hawthorne's, remained in action. The battle raged for 12 days, a grinding, attritional struggle that tested men and equipment to their limits. When it finally ended, when German forces withdrew in defeat, leaving behind thousands of casualties and prisoners, the British Eighth Army had achieved a victory that would prove to be a turning point in the war. In the aftermath, as exhausted soldiers counted their losses and maintained their weapons, a pattern emerged in the casualty reports. Crews equipped with the canvas ammunition bags had sustained fewer casualties and maintained higher rates of fire than those using standard metal tins. The difference wasn't dramatic. War rarely offers dramatic solutions, but it was measurable and significant. Lieutenant Morrison, now promoted to captain after distinguished service during the battle, submitted a detailed report on the performance of the canvas bags. The report made its way through various levels of command, accumulating endorsements and recommendations. 3 months later, in January of 1943, Hawthorne received orders to report to Cairo. The summons came without explanation, leaving him nervous about what he might have done wrong. Instead, he found himself standing before a conference room full of officers, ordnance experts, and logistics specialists. "Private Hawthorne," began a colonel whose name he didn't catch, "your canvas ammunition bag has been the subject of considerable discussion at the highest levels of command. We've reviewed the combat reports. We've examined the construction. We've conducted our own tests." Hawthorne stood at attention, uncertain whether to feel proud or terrified. The colonel continued, "The War Office has decided to adopt a modified version of your design for general issue to all Vickers machine gun crews throughout the British Army. Additionally, similar bags are being developed for other weapon systems. You're being awarded a commendation for innovation in the field, and you're being promoted to corporal." The words took a moment to penetrate Hawthorne's exhausted mind. His canvas bag, the one that had been mocked as a laundry sack, was being adopted by the entire British Army. Furthermore, another officer added, "We'd like you to remain in Cairo for the next month to work with our ordnance specialists on refining the design for mass production. We're looking at producing several 100,000 units. Your practical experience with the construction process will be invaluable." Hawthorne found his voice. "Several 100,000, sir. Every machine gun crew in British service needs to be equipped. That's a considerable number of bags, Corporal." The scale was staggering. What had begun as a personal project, built in secrecy assembly with borrowed materials was becoming standard equipment for one of the world's largest armies. The month in Cairo was surreal. Hawthorne found himself working alongside professional engineers and design specialists, men with university degrees and years of experience. They treated him not as a simple soldier, but as an equal, someone whose practical knowledge was as valuable as their theoretical training. Together they refined the design, making minor modifications to improve durability and ease of manufacture. They developed standardized patterns that could be distributed to factories across Britain and the Commonwealth. They calculated material requirements, production timelines, and distribution logistics. Throughout it all, Hawthorne remained somewhat bewildered by the trajectory his life had taken. He'd joined the Army expecting to serve as just another soldier. Instead, he'd become, however briefly, a contributor to the war effort in a way he'd never imagined. When he finally returned to his unit, now promoted and wearing the 2 stripes of a corporal, he found that his canvas bags had become ubiquitous, not just in his battalion, but throughout the 8th Army. Everywhere he looked, he saw the familiar shape of canvas bags hanging beside machine guns. The mockery had been replaced by something more valuable: quiet acceptance and practical appreciation. Soldiers didn't talk about the bags as innovations or revolutionary equipment. They simply used them the way they used any tool that worked reliably and made their jobs easier. For Hawthorne, that quiet acceptance was more satisfying than any formal commendation could have been. The war continued, of course. The victory at El Alamein was followed by the grinding campaign through Tunisia, then the invasion of Sicily and Italy. Hawthorne served through all of it, no longer as a simple gunner, but as a machine gun section leader, responsible for training new crews and ensuring equipment was properly maintained. He saw his canvas bags in action across a dozen battlefields, from the hills of Tunisia to the mountains of Italy. He trained hundreds of soldiers in their proper use. He answered countless questions about construction techniques and optimal loading procedures. And occasionally, when the fighting paused and men had time to talk, someone would ask him about the invention process, about what had inspired him to question standard procedure and create something different. His answer was always the same: simple and honest. I saw men struggling. I saw men facing danger because their equipment was slowing them down. I thought there had to be a better way. Turns out there was. The canvas ammunition bag wasn't a war-winning innovation on the scale of radar or the Enigma decryption. It didn't change strategic planning or alter the course of campaigns, but it saved lives in small increments across thousands of engagements. It gave machine gun crews a few extra seconds of firing time, a slightly better chance of suppressing enemy forces, a marginally improved probability of survival. In war, margins matter, seconds matter, small improvements multiplied across entire armies, and countless battles accumulate into significant effects. By the time the war ended in 1945, canvas ammunition bags had become so standard that new soldiers didn't realize they'd ever been controversial. The bags were simply part of the equipment issued and maintained like any other piece of kit. The story of their origin faded from common knowledge, remembered only by those who'd been present in the North African desert when a young private from Manchester had decided that regulation equipment wasn't good enough. Hawthorne returned to Britain in late 1945, one of millions of veterans trying to rebuild lives interrupted by 6 years of war. He went back to Manchester, back to the textile mill that his father had somehow kept running throughout the conflict. The transition from soldier to civilian was difficult, as it was for most veterans. The skills that kept men alive in combat had little application in peacetime. But Hawthorne had one skill that proved transferable: the ability to see problems that others accepted as inevitable and to imagine solutions that others dismissed as impossible. He applied that skill to the textile industry, introducing improvements in production techniques, worker efficiency, and quality control. The mill prospered, eventually expanding and becoming one of the more successful textile operations in post-war Britain. He married, raised 3 children, and lived what by all accounts was a quiet, productive life. He rarely spoke about the war, even less about his invention. To his family and friends, he was simply Tom Hawthorne, mill owner, father, and eventually grandfather. But in military museums and historical archives, canvas ammunition bags from the Second World War are preserved with small placards explaining their significance. Some of these placards mention Corporal Thomas Hawthorne's innovation. Most don't. The bags themselves, stained with oil and sand, and the residue of countless battles tell their own story. They tell a story about the difference between accepting things as they are and imagining how they might be improved. They tell a story about the courage required to question established procedures, even when doing so invites mockery. They tell a story about how small innovations, when multiplied across thousands of users and millions of uses, can have profound effects. Most importantly, they tell a story about survival, about the countless small margins that determined who lived and who didn't in the chaos of combat. 10 seconds shaved off a reload time, 10 seconds that could mean the difference between maintaining suppressive fire and being overrun, 10 seconds that saved lives in ways that could never be precisely quantified, but were nonetheless real. The canvas ammunition bag that Thomas Hawthorne designed in the North African desert was never celebrated as a major innovation. It was never featured in newspaper headlines or history book. It was too simple, too practical, too focused on solving one specific problem to capture popular imagination. But to the machine gun crews who used those bags in combat, who felt the difference those 10 seconds made when enemy forces were advancing and ammunition needed to be reloaded immediately, the innovation was profound. It was the difference between vulnerability and capability, between helplessness and control. It was, in the truest sense, a life-saving invention. Years after the war, in 1968, the British Army finally retired the Vickers machine gun from frontline service, replacing it with the more modern weapons. Along with the guns went the canvas ammunition bags, no longer needed for weapons that used different feeding systems. A few bags found their way into museums and private collections. Most were simply disposed of, having served their purpose and outlived their usefulness. They disappeared from active service with little fanfare, remembered by fewer and fewer people as the years passed and the generation that had fought in the Second World War gradually diminished. Thomas Hawthorne passed away in 1979 at the age of 61, his death noted in local Manchester newspapers with brief obituaries that mentioned his successful textile business and his service during the war, but made no mention of canvas bags or ammunition, or the 10 seconds that had made such a difference. By that time, most of the men who'd used his bags in combat were also gone, their memories fading, their stories untold or forgotten. The canvas bags themselves, those that survived in museums, became curiosities, interesting footnotes in the vast catalog of military equipment, but rarely understood or appreciated. Yet the principle behind Hawthorne's innovation endures, not in any specific piece of equipment, but in the mindset that created it. The principle that established procedures should be questioned, that there's always potential for improvement, that small innovations can have significant impacts. That principle, applied across countless fields and endeavors since the war's end, has driven progress in ways both dramatic and subtle. It's the same principle that leads engineers to refine designs, doctors to improve procedures, teachers to develop better methods. It's the recognition that just because something has always been done a certain way doesn't mean it's the best way. In the North African desert in 1942, that principle manifested as a canvas bag that reduced reload times from 45 seconds to 10. In other times and places, it manifests in other ways. But the underlying truth remains constant. Innovation often comes not from dramatic breakthroughs, but from simple observations. This doesn't work as well as it should, and there must be a better way. Thomas Hawthorne saw machine gun crews struggling with cumbersome metal tins during the desperate seconds when ammunition needed to be reloaded. He imagined a simpler solution, a canvas bag with open access, allowing instant retrieval of fresh ammunition belts. He built it, tested it, proved it worked, and in doing so saved lives that can never be counted, but were nonetheless real. They laughed at his canvas cartridge sack, right up until the moment when reloads dropped to 10 seconds and the laughter died, replaced by recognition that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective ones. The story of Thomas Hawthorne and his canvas ammunition bag is not a story of genius or heroism in the conventional sense. It's a quieter story, one about practical problem-solving, persistence in the face of skepticism, and the cumulative impact of of small improvements. It's a story about 10 seconds and what those seconds meant to men fighting for their lives in the deserts of North Africa and beyond. It's a story worth remembering, even as the canvas bags themselves fade into obscurity, because the lesson it teaches remains relevant. Never accept that the current way of doing things is the only way, and never underestimate the impact of making something work just a little bit better. In the end, that's what innovation really is. Not necessarily revolutionary change, but incremental improvement, applied consistently and with purpose, 10 seconds at a time.